I've really been enjoying a lot of Paul's letters in the New Testament, obviously. Um, this spring, Philippians is probably my favorite in terms of his short letters. Romans is my favorite, obviously, in terms of the theology that it teaches. But he writes to Philippi, which was probably his favorite church. Ministers don't ever have favorite churches. Um, but certainly Philippi was Paul's favorite place. Chapter 2 is worth a read in its entirety later on, but I wanted to share with you verse 15 from chapter 2 today, really as a mantra for your living and as a thread throughout this entire sermon. So listen now for God's word to you from Philippians, the second chapter, verse 15. Provide people with a glimpse of good living and of the living God. When I was in Swansboro, North Carolina, 8 years ago, which, by the way, is a place you ought to visit if you ever go to the hallowed East Coast land, a great place. It's where ministry started for Kelly and for me in 1992, believe it or not. I was in Swansboro 8 years ago next month for the funeral of my friend, Nat Sylvester, who owned a bunch of Piggly Wiggly grocery stores up and down the coast. While I was there, I had the opportunity to hug the neck of one of my favorite people on the planet, a fellow by the name of W.T. Casper. Before his heartbreaking descent into the tangled web of Alzheimer's, where he resides now, W.T. owned and operated a place called Casper's Marina, which is a hotbed of boating activity on the Crystal Coast and a great place to catch up on all the local gossip. And WT is this wonderful kind of swirling mixture of Jimmy Buffett and Warren Buffett and Roy Rogers and Will Rogers. And like me, his native tongue is sarcasm. When we lived there 29 years ago, and I was a good 80 pounds heavier than I am now, I was at Casper's one scorching summer afternoon, and I said, WT, look, man, I'm going to strip down to my drawers and jump off the dock to cool off. He glanced up from his paperwork just long enough to look up and down my very rotund frame. Without even cracking a smile, he said, Preacher, please don't do that. It is a no-wake zone. You'll ground every boat between here and the bridge. After I expressed my abiding love to him for his kind words, I went outside. Sure enough, there stood a sign to my right. This is a no-wake zone. You are responsible for your own wake. Now, y'all are a savvy boating crowd living here, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with no-wake zones, let me take just a moment to explain. Wakes are what follow your boat when you pass through the water. In other words, a wake is what you leave behind as you move forward. If you're not careful, or worse yet, if you are willingly defiant, the wakes that you create cause serious problems for those that travel next to you or those that travel behind you. So, what has all this to do with you, you ask? Well, I'm always in search of a new metaphor for you to wrap your brain around. And it occurs to me that the nautical sign I saw that day at Casper's Marina contains some very insightful theological truth, namely this: all of us are responsible for what we leave behind as we move forward in life. My work happens to afford me tons of opportunities to meet with people who are carrying lots of baggage from the past. Things that were said to them, things that were done to them, things that weren't said to them or weren't done to them, which hurt them and scarred them, weighed them down. A lot of us carry a lot of stuff around, and in order for us to carry it, somebody had to load it on us, and those are the people we can usually name through clenched teeth. What we don't always recognize is how much we may be loading on to those who are coming after us. Truth be told, it's often those who carry the most baggage from the previous generation who create the most baggage for the next generation, which means that many of us fail to consider the baggage, the wake that we create for others by our words and by our actions today. Always imprinted on my soul is the story that the preacher Fred Craddock tells of this stern middle-aged dad who, in his religious zeal to raise a righteous son and have this perfect family appearance on the outside, often utilized very cruel words, physical confrontations to make his son toe the line. Several years pass, and in his early 30s, this young man falls prey to a fatal blood disease, sliding in and out of consciousness. As he sits there helplessly watching his son dying, the father reaches out to wipe his son's sweating brow, when suddenly, upon seeing his father's hand, the son recoils and he screams out, "Please don't hit me again, Daddy." Even in a comatose state, his father's wake was indelibly etched on the young man's soul. What kind of wake are you leaving? The Apostle Paul puts it straight to you in Philippians 2 this morning. Provide people with a glimpse of good living and of the living God. Either you are or you aren't. Which one is it? The writer Tom Stoppard is most famous for his Shakespearean parody of Hamlet called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. You should either read it or see it. But Stoppard has some other literary gems, among them The Real Thing, which I reread part of this week, in which he drops the truth bomb that is on the front of your bulletin cover today. No need to look at it, I can tell you what it says. Words, they're innocent, neutral, precise, standing for this, describing that, meaning the other. So if you look after them, you can build bridges across incomprehension and chaos. But when they get their corners knocked off, they're no good anymore. I don't think writers are sacred, he says, but words are. They deserve respect. If you get the right ones in the right order, you can nudge the world a bit. If you get the right words in the right order, you can nudge the world. The clock was ticking slowly early on that spring morning, 60 years ago, next month. Surrounded by jailhouse cinder blocks, he poured out his heart. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. It's easy for those who've never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait, but when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the amusement park that's been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your car because no motel will accept you, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. Words written on scraps of paper given to him by a sympathetic jailer. The right words the right order, the right man, the right time. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words galvanized a moment. They nudged the world. The letter sat on his dresser for 4 years. Robert Gilbert Sr. never opened it. He only touched it when he needed to dust around it because he so badly wanted to give it back to his son unopened. Every time his Marine son was deployed, his boy would ask, "Dad, do you still have my letter?" His dad never wanted to read what was inside the envelope marked, "Dad, open this if I'm wounded. Love, Robert Jr." The call to open it came on March the 8th, 2011. Is Robert Gilbert Sr. there? A voice from Marine headquarters in Quantico, Virginia said. The father felt his stomach drop even before he heard the words, "Your son's been injured in Afghanistan." When he heard the words, "possibly a mortal wound," he sat on the bed and opened the envelope and pulled out 4 handwritten pages of spiral notebook paper. "I'm sorry if you're reading this," is the line with which the letter began. Robert Gilbert, his son, Marine Gunnery Sergeant Robert L. Gilbert Jr., were more than just father and son. They were best friends. Robert Sr., a Richfield, Ohio police officer, became a single dad the day his wife Catherine died of cancer in 1992. He stood at the cemetery that day with Robert Jr., then 9 years old, and his daughter Ruth Ann, his 11-year-old girl, wondering what in the world he was going to do next. As soon as Robert Jr. was old enough to drive, he headed to the Marine Corps recruiter, came home with posters to emulate. He graduated from Revere High School and then from Parris Island. He served 5 tours of duty, 2 in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan. "I believe in sacrificing for freedom," is how Robert Jr. began page 2 of his letter to his dad. Before the fateful phone call, the last time Robert saw his son was in September. After a week together riding motorcycles, his son grabbed 2 beers and he said, "Dad, we got to talk." The 27-year-old Marine looked his 56-year-old dad in the eye and said, "If I'm incapacitated, don't keep me on life support. If we can't smoke cigars and drink a beer and ride motorcycles, let me go." His dad resisted, but his Marine son insisted. So his daddy made a promise he never imagined he'd have to keep. "Dad, you gave me the desire and the strength to do what I do," began page 3. Robert Sr. couldn't be by his son's side to protect him from danger, but he sat by his side on the C-17 cargo plane during that long journey home from Germany. At the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Brigadier General David Berger gave Robert Jr. the Purple Heart as his family looked on in yellow hospital gowns and blue face guards. And the next day, Robert Sr. kept his promise to his son. A room full of his Marine buddies filled little pill cups with Jack Daniels they smuggled in. They sang happy birthday to Robert Jr. Robert Sr. signed the papers to donate his son's organs, and he rubbed a drop of whiskey on his son's mouth, just like he had done 27 years before when his boy was teething. Then each Marine kissed Robert Jr.'s forehead. Robert Sr. told his boy, "I love you. Thank you for being my son." He held his son's head as they removed the ventilator. He placed his hand on his son's heart and felt its last beat on March the 16th, the day on which he first felt it beat, exactly 28 years earlier. "Dad, you gave me the desire and the strength to do what I do. The right words in the right order. They blessed a father so he in turn could bless a son. The right words in the right order nudged a father and a son to greater love. Parents, do your children know how much you love them? Children, have you said what you need to say to your parents? What is it that Tom Stoppard says? If you look after words, you can build bridges across incomprehension and across chaos. You can give people a glimpse of the living God. One day you'll be just a memory to people. Do your best to be a good one. That sign blew me away when I first saw it on the wall of the Hospice Care Center in Wilmington. The words we speak today, the choices we make today, can build bridges across chaos. They shape the future we live into. They shape the memories we make. Why is that so hard to understand? As the Apostle Paul reminds us in Galatians 6, you reap what you sow. You harvest what you plant. You are responsible for your own wake. Are you making memories worth savoring? Are your words giving people a glimpse of the living God? About reaping and sowing and glimpsing and memory making, my girl Anne Lamott says this: perfectionism is the great enemy of your life. It is the voice of your oppressor. It will keep you very scared. It will keep you very restless your entire life if you don't wake up and fight back. My pastor said last Sunday that if you don't change directions, guess what? You're going to end up where you're headed. Is that okay with you, she said, to end up still desperately trying to achieve more? To get the world to validate your parking ticket? To get your possibly dead parents to see how amazing you always were? That's not going to happen. They are either so dead, like mine are, or they are insatiable, or so relieved that you didn't end up divorced. Or if you did end up divorced, they're relieved you are not heavily into drugs. It's hopeless. And this is the good news. Perfectionism is always lurking nearby, like the demonic prowling lion in the Old Testament, waiting to pounce. My God, she says, what if you wake up one day and you're 65 or you're 75 and you never got your memoir or novel written, or you didn't go swimming all these years because your thighs were too jiggly and you had a nice, big, comfortable tummy, or you were just so strung out on perfectionism and people-pleasing that you forgot to have a big, juicy life. It's going to break your heart. Don't let it happen. Pick a new direction and do it now, Shug. You really don't have time to do anything else. You really don't have time to do anything else. So do me a favor. Get silent for a moment, better yet, for 5 minutes today. You will feel the nudge. Trust me. Pay attention to it. Put the right words in the right order and nudge someone in your world. Richard Turner paid attention to the nudge, and because he did, he put the right words in the right order, just like Jesse Gilstrap did for him. Jesse Gilstrap was a 4th grade teacher at Veeder Elementary School in Veeder, Texas, for 45 years. Talk about a medal for heroism. In a letter to her family, Richard Turner wrote this: "To the family of Mrs. Jessie Gilstrap, fourth grade teacher at Veeder Elementary in 1976. From the time I was 1, he said, my sister and I lived with my maternal grandparents. My mother was an alcoholic and had been in and out of several tumultuous marriages. In 1974, she'd gotten married again, decided that she wanted her family together, so she came and got us from my grandparents and moved us from Oak Forest Elementary to Veeder Elementary early during my second grade year. To say the least, things were less than perfect. My mom and her husband continued to drink and fight. My grandparents often visited. I remember them always leaving sad. It wasn't until later I realized it broke their hearts to leave my sister and me in this situation. Yet there wasn't a lot they could do in the early 1970s. Now, don't get me wrong, he says, this note is not to receive pity or sorrow, because the truth of it is, when you are the child of a parent or parents who are battling addiction, the chaos you see and the chaos you live daily becomes your normal. You get home from school, you let yourself in, you play outside until your parents get home, which was usually late because they would meet up at the bar after work. When they got home, you'd lay low while they drank and fought until they finally passed out. Then you'd get up and fix yourself something to eat. Then you'd watch a few shows, get yourself cleaned up and ready for the next day. My sister and I would get ourselves up in the morning, get dressed, head off to school on our own. In 1976, I was a fourth grader at Veeder Elementary School. My teacher was a wonderful lady named Jessie Gilstrap. She was an older lady, soft-spoken, extremely caring, tolerant of all of her students. Mrs. Gilstrap immediately took to me. I remember thinking, I must be her favorite student. She would call on me often to answer questions or do math on the chalkboard. When it would come time for lunch, she would tell the lunch lady that she had, oh darn, forgotten my lunch card along with a few others in the classroom. And I realized now Mrs. Gilstrap was making sure I was fed. As I said, it was 1976. It was the year of the bicentennial. We had a party in our class. All of the parents came to watch. I remember my mom showing up. I immediately knew she was drunk, as did the teachers. It got to the point where they had to ask her to leave. After she left, Mrs. Gilstrap came up to me and said, I need to see you in the hallway. When we got there, Mrs. Gilstrap bent down and looked me in the eyes, tears in them. She said, I want to tell you something. I want you to remember this for the rest of your life. You can be like that, or you can be something incredible. It is your choice. Not long after that, my mother and her husband filed for divorce. My mom brought us back to our grandparents, disappeared for the next 6 years, occasionally showing up for birthdays, for Christmas. My grandparents let us finish the year at Veeder, then transferred us back to Oak Forest. On the first day of school, I showed up to class, and there was Mrs. Gilstrap talking to my new fifth grade teacher. I found out later she'd come over to fill in my new teacher on the details to make sure I was settled in. She gave me a big hug, headed back over to Veeder Elementary to meet her new group of students. I never saw Mrs. Gilstrap again. I've always regretted not finding her, letting her know how much she meant to me, what an impact she had on my life. She was the face of God to me. She's the reason that I'm a person of faith. She passed away before I got the chance to tell her that. So I wanted to let our family know what an awesome teacher she was. I've resorted to putting my story out there, hoping that it finds its way to them. My wife is now a first grade teacher. I always tell her to find the students that seem like they need the most attention, because chances are they do. Signed, Richard Turner, Veeder High School class of 1984. P.S. Mrs. Gilstrap, I chose incredible. She was the face of God to me. She is the reason I'm a person of faith. Jessie Gilstrap put the right words in the right order and became the face of God to somebody else. When you have your chance this week, will you? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.